application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. And please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either English, French, or the floor. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to the microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when their microphone or their neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which the headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. And please also keeping any papers or hands, etc., away from the microphone. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. And we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that I believe almost all witnesses. One witness is still being tested as we speak, and but the rest have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Members, before we go to witnesses, I want to provide you with an update. The Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, has reached out to the clerk and will be available to appear before the committee, along with officials on the housing study for 1 hour on December 7th, with officials remaining for an additional hour afterwards. I would now like to welcome our witnesses with us. So we have the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Mr. Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood, who's a senior researcher there. Welcome. From the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Alex Gray. Welcome back to our committee. He's also the Senior Director of Fiscal and Financial Services Policy at the Canadian Chamber. We have from Tourism Industry Association of Canada, who's no stranger to this committee, Ms. Beth Potter, who's the President, Chief Executive Officer. And from the Université du Québec, Céline Poncelin de Raccord, who's the Vice President of Teaching and Research. Along with Céline, we have Maxime Collert, who's the Government Affairs Officer. We have Wealthsimple Investments joining us, and Jessica Oliver, who's the head government and regulatory relations person at Wealthsimple. We also have Oceans North, and that is the witness that is now being tested, just to make sure everything is working in terms of audio, video, etc., and with the interpreters. And that from Oceans North, we have Amy Nugent, who's the Associate Director of Marine Climate Action. And so on opening remarks, Oceans North will come in at the end, so they have enough time to get tested and be prepared to go. So on that, we are going to open up with the witnesses with their opening statements for 5 minutes, and we'll have Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks to the committee for the invitation. Every year, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives produces an alternative federal budget, which we do in collaboration with dozens of organizations, experts from across the country. Our 2024 edition was released in August, and I'm excited to be able to share some of our recommendations with you. Now, in particular, I'm going to focus my remarks on my own areas of expertise, which are climate policy and green industrial policy, but I'm happy to address questions about the federal budget more broadly. Now, for context, green industrial policy is something our biggest allies and competitors are already engaged in. The US, the EU, China, and others are putting the weight of government behind a cleaner economy. And that means the playing field in growth industries is not level. If we want to compete in a global economy that is moving away from fossil fuels, we need government to play a larger role in the market. And to be clear, this transition is not optional. The Canada Energy Regulator forecasts an 83% decline in oil sands production in its global net zero scenario. The International Energy Agency recently forecast a 76% decline in global oil demand under a similar scenario. So we need to start planning now for what our post-oil economy will look like in the coming decades, whether we like it or not. Now, the federal government has started to experiment with green industrial policy. Budget 2023, as you know, included investment tax credits worth tens of billions of dollars. But this approach of trying to incentivize the private sector to do the heavy lifting of transitioning Canada to a cleaner economy has limits. First, there's no guarantee that the market will buy in, and that was made very clear by the Canada Infrastructure Bank's inability under its original mandate to attract private capital. And for projects of vital national importance, for example, things like tripling the capacity of our national electricity grid, which underpins basically everything else we do on climate, we can't afford to wait and hope that the private sector steps up. Now, second, if the credits turn out to be too generous, they'll effectively pad the profits of private investors without leading to any actual increase in green investment, and that's just a waste of money that could be better spent on public goods. And third, and perhaps most importantly, this market-led approach to green investment will not resolve the regional dimensions of transition. Much of the public money that's been allocated to clean industry is going to flow into corporate headquarters in Toronto and Calgary, and not into the often rural communities that actually need investment and economic diversification. So those are the problems. What are our alternatives? Well, in the alternative federal budget, we call first of all for a comprehensive national green industrial strategy. Now, this government has published lots of strategies for critical minerals, emissions reductions, and so on, but they don't all share a single coherent vision for the economy. We cannot be a climate leader that meets our emissions goals while also being an exporter of oil and gas, either practically or morally. We need a whole-of-economy strategy that starts from the end point, which is an economy free of fossil fuels by 2050, and work backwards to what that means for policy today in every sector. And when it comes to spending, we call for direct public funding, not financing and not corporate incentives, in a number of key sectors, including $5 billion per year to decarbonize and expand the electricity grid, as I mentioned, $15 billion per year for energy efficiency retrofits of homes and buildings. And the federal government is already spending in these and other strategic areas. That's good. The issue is we simply need more capital given the urgency of the climate crisis. We call for new public interest mandates for the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Canada Growth Fund. Instead of trying to de-risk private investment, these institutions should be offering funding and low-cost loans to governments, to communities, especially those most affected by the transition to net zero. In other words, we'd like these institutions to function more like public banks that can support community-led public interest initiatives. We also call for $1 billion per year for more aggressive workforce development policies. It's no secret that we're already facing large skill shortages in key sectors in the clean economy, and that problem is only going to get worse in the coming years. The training and also retraining workers for these jobs will not only enable us to build the green economy we want, but it will also help to ease the transition away from fossil fuels for affected workers in an equitable way. So these are just a handful of recommendations from our alternative federal budget. As I mentioned, the full document includes hundreds of recommendations across 26 chapters in every area of federal policy, so I strongly encourage you to take a look. We provided copies in English and French to the clerk. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mertens-Kirkwood. And now we're going to hear from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And Mr. Gray, please.
It is my privilege to represent the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and deliver a simple but alarming message. Canada's economic competitiveness is slipping. Ultimately, it is economic growth that underpins our standard of living and our ability to provide the services Canadians require. Absent a vibrant economy, future generations will not enjoy the same quality of life and the same quality of opportunity that we around this table have. To remedy this, Ottawa must turn its focus to nurturing growth driven by the private sector. As outlined in our official submission, Ottawa can enact immediate change to improve the fundamentals of our economy. Measures like simplifying the tax code, undertaking regulatory reform, and removing internal barriers to trade need not be expensive, but will generate abundant growth and investment. Reducing the barriers that prevent the private sector from capitalizing on our strategic economic advantages must be at the forefront of government policy. It is common refrain in this committee and among the economic commentariat that poor productivity is Canada's most pressing economic issue. Indeed, the matter is urgent. Canadian productivity is no longer stagnant, but declining. Correcting this trend requires encouraging both private sector innovation and capital investment. Regrettably, we have historically been at pains to promote ourselves as an attractive destination for capital, which has stymied our standard of living. Yet to deliver the shot in the arm our economy badly needs, we must avoid pitfalls such as new business taxes that repel investment. Canada should strive for a tax environment that encourages, rather than deters, investment. A streamlined and efficient tax system based on best practices from around the world is not only a priority, but a necessity. Indeed, our creaky tax system is a hindrance to investment, hence our repeated calls for simplifying the tax code. We also call on the government to avoid imposing new taxes on the business sector, as it currently intends to do in the case of the Digital Services Tax, or DST. As it stands, Ottawa intends to enact a retroactively imposed DST on certain online platforms' revenues. This is despite Canada's participation in international negotiations in which nearly 140 countries, including our largest trading partner, have agreed to delay imposing such taxes. Our objections are numerous, but I'll outline just a few for you today. First, we strongly object to the principle of retroactivity, which robs businesses of the certainty they need to make productive investments in innovation and growth. Second, we oppose any measure which will increase the costs for businesses and consumers at a time of such economic precarity. Finally, we must sound the alarm that successive administrations in Washington have stated that enacting a DST would provoke damaging trade retaliation, potentially against key sectors of the Canadian economy. For the benefit of all Canadians, we urge the government to immediately stand still on its plan to enact the DST and allow the OECD process to complete. Another tax quandary, which Ottawa could quickly rectify at minimal cost, is the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Incentive Program. As it stands, Canada's tax rules provide Canadian-controlled private corporations with access to its incentives that are not available to publicly listed companies, thereby creating an artificial barrier to growth. The mention of publicly listed companies typically conjures images of large multinationals, yet in Canada, 2/3 of TSX-listed companies are SMEs. This is a unique feature of our capital markets relative to the rest of the world and should be accounted for in crafting policies that encourage innovation. In Canada, preventing these publicly listed SMEs from accessing incentives that encourage more spending on research and development is weighing down our economic potential. Budget 2024 presents an opportunity for decisive action. We urge Ottawa to adopt pro-growth policies that will invigorate Canada's economy. As ever, we stand ready to facilitate collaboration between policymakers and the business community to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. And now to Tourism Industry Association of Canada. Ms. Potter, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having invited me here today.
An ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and which have been stewarded by them since time immemorial. Tourism is an important contributor to Canada's economy. Before the pandemic, $105 billion in total spending, contributing 2% of annual GDP and 2 million jobs. Unfortunately, our sector has faced a prolonged recovery from the impacts of the pandemic. Canada's borders only reopened 1 year ago, and international visitors have been slow to return. As of the end of August, we were still 3 million visitors below where we were at this point in 2019. Other key performance indicators are all still below pre-pandemic levels. Many businesses still face persistent hurdles, including low revenue, mounting debt, and struggles to attract an optimal workforce. The new federal tourism growth strategy sets out ambitious objectives to hit by 2030, including increasing our contribution to GDP by 40% and bolstering our international ranking. To reach these targets, industry and government will need to continue to work together. It will also require greater investment. TIAC has identified key recommendations to help with these targets. Our first priority is the mounting debt burden faced by many tourism businesses. Loans made available served as a vital lifeline during the height of the COVID pandemic, but operators still face tremendous financial strain and debt repayments have become daunting. TIAC appreciates the recent revisions to the CEBA, but entrepreneurs still require near-term support to alleviate the debt burden. So we recommend the adoption of new measures to help tourism SMEs remain solvent. Second is the need to rebuild the tourism workforce. A significant labor shortage remains during a critical time of regrowth for the sector. And as such, we recommend extending the Economic Mobility Pathways pilot program to those employed in a wide spectrum of tourism occupations, the creation of a dedicated tourism stream with a permanent residency track under Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program, and to fund a workforce strategy for Indigenous tourism. Next is to invest in tourism assets. There remains a pressing need for investment in tourism assets throughout Canada, including airports, ports, accommodations, conference centers, and attractions. We recommend that the government adopt a comprehensive approach to expanding Canada's tourism assets, including a tourism infrastructure fund to support major capital projects, a tax credit program to incentivize investment in the creation and upgrading of assets, and an investment incentive to provide airports at the capital to expand and update infrastructure. Such investment will ultimately lead to dividends for the government through increased tax revenue. It would also spur increased private investment, including direct foreign investment. These investments need not necessarily come from new funding sources. Existing programs like the Canada Infrastructure Program could be fine-tuned with resources earmarked specifically for tourism. Another key priority is expediting access for visitors to Canada. Application backlogs for visitor visas remain a deterrent for many international travelers. The government could bolster IRCC's special events program to ensure that business event travelers do not face visa processing delays. And for the cruise ship industry to prosper, we also need to ensure that there are SEBA port coverage in all small communities. Environmental sustainability is also an important policy pillar for TIAC. Government investment is needed for such thing as the production of sustainable aviation fuel in Canada, noting that if this was done, Canada could become the global leader in the production of sustainable aviation fuel. Finally, TIAC is calling on the government to ensure housing affordability in tourism hubs. We recommend that the government create a working group to address concerns, assess needs, and consider how tourism can contribute to affordable housing objectives. In closing, I trust that our full submission that we've provided will be helpful to you as you consider priorities for the federal budget in 2024. Merci. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you, Ms. Potter. And now we'll hear from the Université de Québec, and I believe the time is going to be shared by Celine and Maxime. Correct? Yes. Okay. You may begin.
Mr. Chair, members of the Standing Committee on Finance, we would like to thank you for your invitation to take part in the pre-budget consultations for the 2024 budget. Founded in 1968 following the adoption of a unanimous law by the Quebec National Assembly, UQ contributes to making higher education accessible to francophones throughout Quebec, thanks to its 10 institutions and presence in nearly 40 municipalities. More than 800,000 diplomas have been awarded by one of our 10 establishments. Today, almost 1 in 3 Quebec students is enrolled at Université du Québec, which represents about 100,000 students each year. That makes Université du Québec the largest French language university in the Americas. We believe that the scientific research and university studies are one of the pillars of our society. We believe it's important to increase efforts in the areas of graduate scholarships, research funding, and support for Canada's French-speaking scientific community. I'll hand this over to my colleague, Mrs. Poncelin-de-Rocourt, who will talk about our recommendations. Thank you. I would like to begin with a subject that is of interest to scientific communities. Over the past 20 years, the amount of higher education grants in Canada has stagnated, despite a 30% rise in the CPI. In practice, our most brilliant minds are living in poverty, and that is why we're asking the government to increase the value of the Canada Graduate Scholarships by 50% and to adjust their value to inflation. Only 3% of postgraduate students receive support from one of the granting councils. It is known that this is determining in success, and there's a true risk of an exodus of highly qualified people. We believe it is necessary to double the number of higher education scholarships. We should point out that the current quota system has perverse effects in terms of equity of access to grants and scientific development capacity in the regions. Each university is allocated a certain number of grants calculated on the basis of the total amount of research grants. And this system encourages a dynamic of cumulative advantages. 15% of Canadian universities take up 73% of postgraduate grants, universities that are generally concentrated in very large urban centers. To counter the concentration of bursaries in a few universities, the quota system should provide that each institution has a minimum number of bursaries in the 3 research sectors. In terms of research funding, we notice that the increasingly large share of budgets allocated to the medical field and to major competitors, example Apogee, tends to favor large universities with medical faculties. It is vital to harness the full potential of the scientific community. Why? Here's an example. We are fortunate to have an intersectoral health research group, and researchers tell us that it is essential in order to reduce inequalities in access to health, to adapt our preventive actions and our healthcare and social services interventions to the realities of rural and remote regions. For example, rural regions are important, and our researchers cannot all live and work in large urban centers. And research cannot be carried out solely in large university hospitals, but also in the hundreds of other places where care and services are provided daily. Research strengths exist throughout the country, should develop, and make a greater contribution to meeting the challenges facing Canadians. We have made 3 recommendations. 1, increase the total base budget of the granting councils by at least 10% per year for 5 years. As the Bouchard report points out, research funding has not kept pace over the last 20 years. 2, that these investments be accompanied by measures to ensure greater equity between the areas of research funded. For example, at the Canadian Institute for Health Research, 60% of funding is concentrated in biomedical and clinical research. This leaves out an essential component of non-medical scientific expertise related to health, and it contributes to the concentration in funding. 91% of the money is sent to 15 universities in Canada. Also, we hope that the federal departments have budgets earmarked to support their research needs in collaboration with the universities in order to respond to Canada's priorities. I'll end with a few words on the support for French language research. English has largely taken over. It is vital that Canada invests in ensuring the vitality of the French-speaking research community, which is made up of more than 35,000 researchers in the country. We provided some examples in our report. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you, Mrs. Céline Poncelin de Rocourt.
Now we're going to hear from Wealthsimple Investments, Ms. Jessica Oliver.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for having me. My name is Jessica Oliver. I'm head of government relations at Wealthsimple, a financial services company headquartered in Toronto, serving more than 3 million Canadians. 1 in 5 Canadians, 18 to 40, are Wealthsimple clients. We believe Canadians deserve better and simpler financial services. Our products range from investing and trading to free or pay what you want tax filing, and more recently, a no-fee checking account, which offers 4% interest on cash balances accrued daily with no strings attached. A remote-first company, I'm one of about 1,000 employees spread across 9 provinces from coast to coast to coast. We're reaching clients in new ways and in underserved segments. Wealthsimple's low-fee group retirement savings plan serves small and medium-sized businesses, 96% of which did not offer any workplace retirement savings before working with us. And since launching our first home savings account in August, we've opened an average of 1,000 FHSAs each day. But innovation will only get you so far when the infrastructure underpinning financial transactions in Canada is out of date and access to it so unequal as to prevent true competition. It's a problem for companies like ours, but it's a much bigger problem for Canadians who pay some of the world's highest banking fees for outdated and inadequate service. Last week, you heard from Fintechs Canada on open banking, and we fully support their comments on its benefits. Our submission focuses on a second enabling project, the Real-Time Rail, or RTR. Canada is the only country without a true RTR. More than 70 countries worldwide are reaping the benefits of real-time payments. The Center for Economics and Business Research estimates that by 2026, the world's 5 largest RTR markets will generate an additional $150 billion in GDP as a result of real-time payments. Our recommendations call for the implementation of Canada's RTR as soon as possible and for 3 features critical to its success. 1, 24/7, 365 settlement, that is an end to the Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 restrictions. 2, fair and transparent pricing where all qualified participants pay the same rate per transaction, regardless of size. And 3, leadership to ensure provincial and municipal governments are prepared to use the RTR and realize savings from day one, including savings identified by Public Services and Procurement Canada on the opportunity to phase out physical checks, particularly related to distributing emergency relief funds. Though certain payments in Canada might feel instant, settlement delays behind the scenes make it impossible for Canadians, businesses, and governments to manage their finances efficiently. Prenons l'exemple d'un étudiant.
Let's take the example of a student beginning their studies at Université de Québec. Their first tuition installment is due on the same day as their payday. The university's website, and in fact, most post-secondary institutions clearly states a payment received after the deadline can lead to a late payment fee. Expect delays from 2 to 5 working days to receive payment.
Plan for 2 to 5 days settlement is a solid indication that questions and concerns around settlement timing and the corresponding fees have been raised a few times. When a student initiates a payment to university, it disappears from their account immediately into the ether until it settles at some unknown point. The student could risk a late payment fee or may have to access a payday loan to bridge the gap. There are countless examples affecting small businesses, particularly those with just-in-time supply chains, households, nonprofits, governments, government agencies. Last week, RBC's Financial Wellbeing Survey found that 48% of Canadians and 63% of millennials said that stressing about money is impacting their mental health. These are real problems affecting real Canadians that the RTR would meaningfully address. The federal government has supported the development of the RTR since 2015 and gave Payments Canada a mandate to build an RTR that promotes fair and open access, enables competition and innovation, fosters fair and transparent pricing, implements appropriate risk controls, and considers end user interests. These are the right policy objectives and must not be compromised. On this, the government has our full support. And one final clarification. The stability of Canada's banking system is appropriately a great source of pride. But the absence of modern payment infrastructure that is treated as a public utility, an economic enabler akin to a highway or broadband internet, has nothing to do with the liquidity or integrity of our banks. To the best of my knowledge, the RTR has support across all party lines, and my hope today is to find advocates across all party lines as well. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Oliver, for your opening statement. And with Ms. Oliver, we did find it was a little choppy, and sometimes it's the internet, sometimes it's the device. One of the things we can do is just no movement and also to speak slowly and clearly, and that will help everybody out. But thank you for that. I also want to just let members know that Oceans North, we do have Amy Nugent. I think she may be on the screen, or you'll see her on the screen. Unfortunately, we are having technical difficulties with her headset. And but what we are going to do is that Ms. Nugent will be able to, as submitted, her opening statement, but also her brief to this committee. And if members do have questions, they can pose the questions. She'll be able to hear them, and then she'll be able to get back to our committee with answers with those. But we apologize to Ms. Nugent and to members that we will not be able to hear from her directly here. Okay, so on that, we are going to move to the members' questions, and in this first round, each party has up to 6 minutes to ask our witnesses questions. We are starting with MP Morantz for the first 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for their opening statements. They were very interesting, all of them. Mr. Gray, I just wanted to touch base on your statement. You said that Canada's competitiveness is slipping, and in the statement, your submission, it says that our international competitors continue to outpace us. And I have to say, I agree with you completely. We had, for example, Robert Asselin was here last week sounding the alarm bell around the fact that interest rates are outpacing economic growth, and that government spending, particularly on social programs that people rely on very much, is not sustainable. Stats Canada just this week indicated that Canada is slipping into a technical recession. We had the governor of the Bank of Canada in this committee just a couple of days ago, where he cautioned the government that its spending is not very helpful. Interestingly, the BDC just issued a report saying that over the last 20 years, there are 100,000 fewer entrepreneurs in this country than there were 20 years ago, or basically a 12% reduction in entrepreneurs. The OECD published a chart recently called Fear of Failure. It says that, as it turns out, Canadians now lead all G7 countries in citing fear of failure as a roadblock to being an entrepreneur, according to the OECD, having moved up from 5th spot 5 years ago. So higher than Britain, Japan, Italy, France, the US, and Germany. I was reminded when I read this about writer Paul Wells said something recently that I thought was quite apt. He said, if you run a successful business in Canada, you're made to feel that you have done something wrong. I have to say, Mr. Gray, in the context of everything that's going on, I could only characterize this government's management of the economy as nothing short of economic malpractice. Would you agree?
Government should very strongly consider that over the past 8 years, we have said extremely similar things in our submissions, and that's the need for pro-growth economic policy, for pro-growth taxation policy. To the tax point, I believe it was promised in the 2015 platform that tax reform would happen. It has not happened since then. Indeed, it has not happened since the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. So it's open game for anyone in government to take that upon themselves. We would welcome it. As I mentioned in the statement, it is fundamental to our economic competitiveness, and I think it's partly fundamental to the problem of entrepreneurship, as you said. I see that failure of entrepreneurship as sort of a microcosm of what we hear from our larger members, that they don't see where they can invest responsibly to yield productive returns. And I think for a lot of Canadian entrepreneurs, they just don't see how they can make a go of it. So it is a pressing concern among our memberships of all sizes, and we hope some of our recommendations will be duly accounted for in the upcoming budget.
You do have some constructive suggestions in your report, which I appreciate. For example, you talk about something that is we've talked about a great deal, which is credentials for new Canadians, for example, fast-tracking credentials for new Canadians to make sure that they're contributing to the economy. One of the things that I really liked about your report is something I've been harping on for quite a while, is that this government never seems to want to miss an opportunity to charge people more for a beer. And you correctly point out, although they did pause it last year, they made no indication that they're going to do it again next year. The accelerator tax has been a thorn in the side of that industry for years now. I'm wondering if you could comment on and also just on the issue of interprovincial trade, those three, if you could just give your position on those.
I'll start with the alcohol tax because that's very simple. And the fact that it's an automatic escalator tax means that it elides parliamentary review. If we want to raise taxes on something, it should go to debate. I think that's pretty simple and clear. As for credential recognition, many of our members, particularly on the smaller side of the spectrum, have consistently highlight a lack of skilled talent as a barrier to growth. There are many foreign credentials which are nearly equivalent to the Canadian counterparts. Many of them, for example, in healthcare, in skilled trades, what I think are not only badly needed right now in the Canadian economy, frankly.
Just a quick one for Ms. Oliver. Real-time rail paused again. Every other G7 country seems to have a version of it. How much is this costing Canadians, in your view?
I think I don't have a number to share. I certainly, in our submission, we referenced the impact on cash flow for businesses. I believe in 2019 report by Deloitte in the UK found that 63% of businesses hold back capital to mitigate challenges with cash flow, when really, if they were able to count on real-time payments, that they could deploy that capital in other ways. So I think the cost is significant, and I think it spans across individuals, families, small businesses, large businesses, governments at all levels, and government agencies.
Now to MP Weiler, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and just for all the great diversity of views that are being brought forward. I want to start my questions with Ms. Potter, who is in a very familiar place for me in the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Of course, where the average hotel rate right now in Vancouver is $346 a night, which is not the top, but the average. In your pre-budget submission and in your opening statement, you recommended that a tax credit program be put forward to help invest in tourism-related infrastructure. I was hoping you could explain to the committee why the Tourism Industry Association of Canada sees that as necessary, and the type of benefits that you foresee in that type of mechanism being brought forward.
Well, thank you very much, and always great to see you, MP Wheeler. I will say that when we are building hotels, as an example, the long-term gain is far down the road. So, we've got an example right now in Calgary where we've got a new convention center that has been built, but we don't have any hotel rooms to go with it. The idea of building those hotel rooms kind of off the beaten track and tied to a convention center, which is much needed, the risk associated with that is due to an unknown factor of, how often is that building going to be used? How often are those hotel rooms going to be used? So to incentivize private investment in coming in to build those hotels and give us the required rooms in order for us to continue to attract international business events that will then add to the economic prosperity of Calgary. That is where we will need the help. Just as an example, I can tell you that in other cities, we are looking at private development investments in things like the event center and entertainment district in the billions. The estimated cost for the Calgary Event Center and entertainment district is $1.2 billion. Being able to leverage that with a tax incentive to be able to attract the right investor to come in and build those hotels, which as I said, would contribute to the economic vitality of Calgary, would help us in making sure that the right capital is brought in and put in place.
Thank you. You made a number of other suggestions related to rebuilding the workforce and developing a workforce strategy. I was hoping you could maybe first just give a sense of what is the amount of unfilled jobs right now that you see in the tourism industry?
So we have about 300,000 unfilled jobs at this point in time across our industry and across all types of positions. Just to give you a sense of where that has come from, first of all, prior to the pandemic, we were already in a challenging situation when it came to labor. The pandemic heightened that. We immediately lost 1 million jobs right off the hop. We've been building that back. But we are an industry that has been in a growth position for the 10 years prior to the pandemic and look to get back to that in order for us to reach the growth targets outlined in the federal strategy. We are going to need to add not only fill the jobs we have, but add another 85,000 jobs between now and 2030. These are jobs that are year-round, they're full-time, they are as highly skilled. One of the top jobs that we are needing to fill are cooks and chefs in order for us to continue to deliver on the culinary experience that visitors to our country have come to expect. So working with IRCC, we've seen a number of changes to policy over the last few months, which we're incredibly grateful for. But really a long-term strategy is something that is required, and specifically for the Indigenous tourism sector. We've got a real challenge there, and my colleagues at the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada tell me that they are going to be in an even more precarious situation as far as labor is concerned. So they need to figure out, we need a strategy in place to ensure that we are attracting the right folks to our industry, that we are giving them the tools that they need in order to grow within the industry, but also to develop and to deliver on the brand promise that Canada has put forth as a destination of choice.
Absolutely, and I know that's one of the areas that's identified in the new tourism growth strategy where we can see some of the greatest potential for the growth of the sector in Canada. With my remaining time, I know you mentioned there was a recommendation to look at extending the repayment period of the CEBA and HASCAP loans. And given that I know that a large number of businesses in the tourism sector are seasonal, what risk do you see over the next year of challenges for those businesses having to repay those loans before they have the seasonal business come in?
In a short answer, Ms. Potter, please.
Sure. We did a study with Nanos Research that showed that 55% of tourism businesses had taken on a large amount of debt during the pandemic. 45% of them have told us that if there aren't some changes made to the repayment structure, that they could close their doors in the next 3 years.
And now to MP Samari.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to thank all the witnesses for their presence here today, and a word for Mrs. Nugent. Perhaps I'm not pronouncing this correctly. We're going to read your statements, and we will take this into account. Same as the testimony of each witness. I particularly appreciated the last exchange with Mrs. Potter with regards to the risk and the current situation. Rest assured that we will continue to ask for the government to be more flexible to ensure the survival of these important industries. My questions will be for Mrs. Poncelet de Rocourt and Mr. Colleret. Thank you very much for your presence here today. It was very nice to have an exchange with you a while ago on the Hill. First question, Mrs. Poncelet de Rocourt, you spoke about concentration of grants in a very small number of universities. Could you elaborate on this, please? Yes. First of all, I'd like to highlight that the granting bodies are doing a very good job with regards to the grants and the programs that allow to fund research as freely decided by the researchers themselves. But when we look at the data from 2000 to 2021, we see that we have seen an increase of 26% by the government of Quebec. That is proportional, more or less, with the weight that we have in the volume of researchers in our establishments over the total volume. However, when we look at funding coming from the federal government, it takes up a smaller share. It could be 11%, and this is explained by the importance of budgets that are awarded, more specifically in the medical field. And of course, the pandemic has increased this, and also a part of the lion's share are given to huge projects such as Apogee. And so this tends to favorize or benefit large universities with huge research teams who are able to respond to these mega projects. I gave you earlier the example of research being funded in health, but that is stuck in the biomedical paradigm and clinical research. And also, grants are very concentrated for universities that have faculty of medicine. On our side, our establishments are working in health. We have an interdisciplinary health network with a team of over 200 scientists and almost 900 students, and they are specialized in studying screening, life conditions, vulnerable populations, and they're very busy and active in the regions of Quebec. And these are researchers that are having difficulty in obtaining funding, given the fact that the paradigm is really concentrated on the medical sector. And so there are many factors that lead to this concentration. I spoke earlier about the quotas as well, and we can see that more grants that are received by a university, it is benefited in also in other types of competitions or grants that are awarded. And there's a system that is concentrating the resources in a very small amount of universities. Thank you. This helps us to better understand the inequality that we hope will be corrected. Here's another subject with regards to bursaries awarded to students. If I understood your presentation, increasing the amount of bursaries granted to graduate students is not sufficient in and of itself. Is that correct? Correct. We have two elements. First of all, I mentioned it, there's the issue of the quota system. So if we increase the amount of bursaries without reviewing how they are distributed, the risk is to increase the inequality. And as I was saying earlier, I think that the statements made by other witnesses also show the extent to which, whether it be for tourism or the green economy, we need to have a solid ecosystem in all regions to take into account local realities and regional realities. The concentration that we see here is endangering the research ecosystem and its quality. If we double the amount of bursaries, we already have 73% that are concentrated in 15% of institutions. Of course, more bursaries will be given out, but they will benefit essentially a very select few institutions. So if we take, for example, La Plume, that groups together all small and medium-sized universities, this include 56% of students, and they don't receive proportionality in the amount of bursaries. So the current form does not allow for benefits for all. And oftentimes, smaller universities, institutions have distinct needs. If I look at University of Quebec, 1 student out of 2 are first generation, so they are the first in their family to go to university, and so this contributes to a more skilled workforce, and so we need a system that will allow these people to access bursaries. And because excellence doesn't have an address, it exists in all regions. We need to have quotas that do allow, at a minimum, for all universities to have a certain amount of bursaries that can be distributed in research sectors in order to develop scientific skills locally and respond to the issues that local organizations can put on the table. Thank you.
MP Blakey, please.
Chair, and I'll echo the thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today, including Ms. Nugent. We're sorry that technical difficulties are preventing you from participating in the meeting, but do look forward to reading the opening comments and brief that are on the way. I wanted to ask Ms. Potter, just just for some further clarity, would you like to see a recommendation from the Finance Committee to the effect that the repayment period, including for the forgivable portion of the CEBA, be extended?
In short answer, yes, we would. The repayment changes that were made earlier this year just don't go far enough to give the tourism businesses that time to pay back the loan and to be able to realize the forgivable portion.
Thank you for the numbers that you shared with us earlier. Mr. Gray, I'm wondering if you're hearing from your membership about the impact of the upcoming deadline for CEBA loans, and if you agree that those deadlines should be extended, including for the forgivable portion.
I think 18 days is quite a short extension, frankly. It just seems like a half measure. If you're open to extending it, why not actually extend it?
And do you think it should be extended?
Yeah, I think that's broadly supportive at this point. It's been a couple years. Businesses are still struggling. The economy looks a lot different than it did at the beginning of the pandemic. I see very little downside.
Okay. Now, I know that kind of extension appears on the government ledger as a form of spending. Are you concerned that that would be inflationary?
I think given the scale of the program and the consequences of possibly not extending it, i.e. the closure of further small businesses, and I think the effect is probably minimal.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I wonder, Mr. Mertens-Kirkwood, if we could come back to some of your recommendations. I know you had talked about workforce development, and so I'm wondering, one of the things we know is that there is churn in the labor market, and employment insurance, particularly as we start to talk about entering recession territory, is a really important stabilizer both for the economy and for individual households in a time of economic churn. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of employment insurance reform that the government's been promising for 8 years now, as well as the importance of reinvesting in EI training programs as one component of a workforce development strategy.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I don't know too much about the EI reform process. Certainly, EI is important. It's an important part of our social safety net. And as we see every time a region goes through economic turmoil, we often see how inadequate EI is. Right? It can work in general, but often when we're in crisis, EI is insufficient. And we've had governments at the provincial level, at the federal level, step in the case of coal, for example, or other resource transitions with top-ups or whatever. Now, we haven't seen any of that recently in the government's sustainable jobs agenda. So it's great that we are moving forward with this, what would otherwise be called just transition agenda. But there doesn't appear to be any new money in there that would actually support workers in a meaningful way. What we're concerned about, though, is that EI is only one part of the equation, right? EI is sort of a parachute for workers who need it in a crisis, but that's not the same as providing the new job at the end of the day. And we see that a lot in resource communities historically, and now we're worried about it in the case of coal, oil, and gas, where you can support a worker for 6 months, a year, but if there's no job at the end of the road, then you haven't really helped them transition. So that's why we've argued for more investment, proactive economic investment in those communities.
And how do you think government should tie skills training to creating those new job opportunities so that Canadians who may be losing work in one sector are prepared either to bridge into retirement or to take a job in a new sector, or transpose some of their existing skills to something similar but different?
Well, the most important thing, because that's a great question, the most important thing is having some clarity about which direction we're headed in. And we saw that with the coal transition. Right? We gave a deadline. We said we aren't going to be burning coal by this year, and that allows workers, that allows the corporations that are affected, the communities that are host to the coal industry, to plan for that transition. You've got a runway, and right now we don't have that in oil and gas. Right? If you're a high school kid in Calgary right now, what is your economic future? Right? You have people in one ear telling you that your best bet is still oil and gas. People in the other ear telling you that you need to be looking at different kinds of careers. There's no clarity. That means those communities, those industries, they can't plan for the future. So we need greater clarity about our economic direction first. That basically underpins all of our workforce development. But then we also need to be proactive. We know, I mean, this is certainly the case in a lot of the building trades, where not only do we have skill shortages now, but we can see enormous skill shortages in 10 years. And that's about as long as it takes to train someone up from start to finish for a lot of the skilled trades. So, and that's why government in particular needs to be leading on that, is we need to train these workers so that we have them when we need them. We can't wait until we've got shortages and then hope retroactively we can train workers quickly to meet those needs.
And so does that mean that, for instance, in the example of investment tax credits, like one of the things that's unique about this that New Democrats pushed for was to have prevailing wage conditions as well as apprenticeship conditions attached to those ITCs? Do you think mechanisms like that are important to build in some of the workforce development and ensure that some of the wealth generated by these investments finds its way back to workers who are actually producing that wealth, as opposed to just the capital that is behind the project?
Yeah, absolutely. We were very happy to see the labor conditions in the most recent budget. We don't think they went far enough. Right? You could go further, not just requiring a small share of apprenticeships, but also looking at other kinds of economic benefits. We support the use of community benefit agreements more broadly to ensure that the benefits of investment are widely shared, and looking at other concerns in terms of workforce development. Because it's not just about bringing apprentices in. We also want to diversify that workforce as well. How can we bring more women into the fold, more immigrants, more racialized Canadians? How can we diversify that workforce? And using conditions on federal funding is one way to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, MP Blakey and members. Witnesses, we're moving into our second round. Timings are a little different in this round. So MP Richards, I believe, is up for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So a couple of questions for you, Beth, from TIAC. I want to start with a question on labor. Liberal member Mr. Weiler asked you about this earlier, but I don't know if he really asked the right question. So I'd like to touch on it again. Labor shortages for many tourism and hospitality businesses really right across the country. This is a big issue, but I think it's particularly acute in communities like those that I represent in Banff and in Canmore, communities like Mr. Weiler is supposed to represent in Whistler. Places like that where they're remote tourism-based economies. It's where people are most attracted, but it's also where it's most difficult to get the labor. And you had mentioned that there's a need for long-term solutions. I think you can put it another way, that this is really a permanent problem for which the government has a temporary solution. We obviously need to see long-term, as you mentioned, more permanent solutions. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to those solutions, what you see them needing to be. What can the government do to remove some of the barriers to the success of the industry in the way of being able to get labor to fill the positions we need to fill?
So thank you, MP Richards, for that question. I will say that there's two pieces that government, I think, has a role to play in as far as assisting industry to attract and maintain a healthy workforce. One is, when the two destinations that you just mentioned, Banff and Whistler, are prime examples of unaffordable housing getting and not being available for workers. Add to that their location, which means transportation to the location is also challenging. I can take that to a different community in Ontario, the town of Collingwood and Blue Mountains. Workers are having to live an hour away because that's where the houses are that they can afford, because it's become such a great destination. It's driven up the cost of housing within the local community. So in order to have people live where they work and work where they live, government's attention to more affordable housing builds, some specific incentives to building more rental housing, and also looking at working with the provinces, territories, and the cities around building more transportation infrastructure. So that's one place there. From a immigration standpoint, we've seen some movement on making it easier for folks that have the skill sets that we need to get into the country, but a lot more work is needed in that space. Changes to which not codes get priority for entry into Canada. Also having a program dedicated to tourism, especially understanding that there are seasonality requirements that we have. So for instance, again, I'll go back to your neighborhood of Banff. A lot of folks that work within the ski industry actually follow the ski industry globally. It's a global workforce. So having temporary foreign workers who can come in for the season and then leave, but then come back the next year without having to go through the LMIA process and the expense that is attached to that is incredibly important. Recently, the Trusted Employer Program was announced for the temporary foreign worker program. But you have to have 2 years of 2 years with the program to be eligible for to be noted as a trusted employer. We had 2 years at least of employers that were not using the program. And so I've asked if the temporary foreign worker program could give the tourism industry kind of a reprieve out of 2020 and 2021 and maybe even 2022, so that if they were a trusted employer prior to the pandemic, they could pick up that status now. And unfortunately, that's not something that we've been able to move the needle on at this point.
And I'm glad you raised that, because that certainly is going to be a huge barrier to the industry to be able to utilize this program that's supposed to be there to help the industry, and it will do nothing, unfortunately. And so thank you for
MP
raising
Richards. Yep. And now we're going to MP Zarowitz, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all the presenters for their outstanding presentations. I wish I had time for all of you, but I do not. Ms. Potter, I will not be asking you questions, but you made excellent recommendations, particularly around a tourism stream, where you could bring in some of the newcomers. I think that's very much something that I know that there's a lot of discussion, as well as the thing that you just talked about in terms of a trusted employer. I think that's something that very much we're also discussing. And visa processing, that's been the bane of all of our existence. So I really appreciate you mentioning those. I'm going to be directing most of my questions to Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray, a million thank yous to you for making some very productive recommendations around how do we tackle the productivity issues. You were quite clear around your simplifying the tax code, following best practices globally. You talked about modifying regulations, and then you talked about internal barriers and eliminating them. This committee knows very well I've been pushing a motion to try to get them to consider that we study how is it that we start tackling those internal trade barriers. So my question to you is, how do we get started on it? I think it sometimes feels like it's an overwhelming thing. And how do we get started? What would be your recommendations on how do we get started on that?
Federalism is a tricky thing, and it's sort of the bane of all these recommendations that we put forward. I think the role of the federal government is twofold. Primarily, it is to serve as a convener for the provinces and, in some cases, municipalities. And I think just sort of set the stage for that dialogue and sort of laying out the costs of these internal trade barriers to Canadians, and sort of, attempting to rectify between, some provinces or other provinces, why they exist, what the costs are, what the benefits are, and sort of trying to smooth that out, if you will. The other that we've recommended before, and I would still like to see, is providing a public registry of what these internal barriers to trade are and what they cost. Some of them are quite ludicrous, in terms of certain tires being on certain trucks, that kind of thing. That grabs headlines. Like politically speaking, I mean, that's something people will pay attention to. That's people will read, and they shouldn't exist. So I think it's a good starting point. Obviously, it's a simple issue. Trucks' tires won't fix the internal trade barriers, but work is needed, and we love to see it happen as quickly as possible.
No, I I think that's an excellent recommendation. Sometimes you just need to see the full list. I think what happens is sometimes we get caught with some of the bigger items like beer and wine. If you just take those off the table and you see the million other sort of irritants to say that, the tire conditions or the materials is different in Nova Scotia versus Quebec, you're sitting there and thinking, this is crazy. So anyways, that's a great recommendation. I then want to move on to, we talked about productivity. I want to talk about business investment. Business investment is very low in Canada, even though this isn't happening now, but we used to have very, very low interest rates. And even at that time, business investment continued to be low money in terms of investment, in terms of equipment, low in training as well. And we're talking a lot about training right now. So the federal government's actually put in a colossal amount of extra money on training and retraining. We've actually sent it down to the provinces, which is where they design the programs. But our businesses need to invest as well. Do you have any recommendations about how we can incentivize business investment into equipment and into training?
I think, we've recommended extending capital cost allowances, for example, to make it more attractive for businesses to invest in the capital that makes them more productive. When we talk about productivity as an issue, I think it sometimes comes across as thorny to people because they think, I'm working, 12 hours a day, I work, I don't stop, and you're telling me I'm not productive. Whereas the substance of the matter is that people are not as productive because their businesses don't necessarily invest in the tools, capital, software that could make them more productive. For example, some people at smaller companies get bogged down in filing their quarterly expenses. There's probably better software out there that would allow them to file it more quickly, but it's an investment. It's not, it's not necessarily something all businesses can afford, so they stick with the older system. It costs employees time to do so.
Anything beyond the CCA, if you have any recommendations, kindly submit it to us. I think we are looking for the best ideas.
Absolutely.
And then the last thing I want to talk about is I know that Mr. Morantz is very concerned about our entrepreneurs. I think we all are. We want to make sure that they feel supported. As someone who spends a lot of time with entrepreneurs, we do have excellent funding at the regional level. So FedDev Ontario, lots of money through Futurepreneur, lots through ISED programs. There's lots for Canadian innovators in the first, second stage. Where they get stuck is when they're trying to build their company at the third or fourth stage. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we learned on committee is that only 4% of our Canada Pension Plan is actually invested in Canadian businesses. It's 50% in Australia and 75% in the United States. Do you think we should be making some adjustments to our Canada Pension Plan in order to be able to make those investments in our entrepreneurs and innovators?
I needed a very short answer because we're well over time.
Sure. It's very common in other jurisdictions to do that. 4% is startlingly low.
Thank you, MP Zerowitz. To MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, une autre.
Thank you. My question is for Mrs. Posselin de Lucon or Mr. Colleret. Today, my esteemed colleague, Maxime Blanchet-Jonca, is at the Convention Center in Quebec. It's a Francophone scientific summit that is being held. According to you, what initiatives could the federal government take in order to ensure the vitality and the promotion of research and scientific production in French in Quebec, but also in Francophone communities outside of Quebec? Thank you. Yes. This morning, I was arriving from this wonderful week at this convention, and Rémi Quirion, who is the chief scientist of Quebec, he published in the Devoir this morning an article in order to celebrate science in French, and he was explaining what is happening right now and what could be done in the future. And I think that he has strong support from Mrs. Mona Nemer, the Chief Science Advisor for Canada. So the French language has to be promoted. We see a reduction in French in scientific circles. And this morning he was saying that almost 90% of scientific articles in the world are published in English, but it was 60% in the mid-50s. So this is French, but also the plurality of languages is important in order to allow one, for researchers to have a career in their mother language, but also to allow the population and businesses to have access to up-to-date research in the language they work in. So more than ever, we need to support the Francophone scientific community to show that French has its place in science and that it is possible to have a scientific career in French. For this, researchers have to be able to conduct their research in French, submit their research applications, their applications for funding in French, and publish in French. So we need to support the different initiatives, different publications for general consumption, such as Sciences Vie and many others, make science available in French to increase discoverability. We also need to increase discoverability of scientific content and services, such as the help to research. If we look at the investment that was made by the federal government in heritage, at Heritage Canada, we see that we really need to support, through initiatives such as these, services in order to support Francophones who also are in a minority setting. So to make sure that the grants are accessible fairly for those who want to conduct research in their language, so that people can publish their research in their language, and also to support the entire industry and all the mechanisms for simultaneous interpretation or translation.
I'm sure there'll be other opportunity for you to expand on that, but thank you. And now we're moving to MP Blakey, please.
Much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gray, a curious thing happened on Monday. I was in the House for debate on the Conservative leader's housing bill, and my colleague, Jenny Kwan, who's our housing critic, asked him a question about the importance of building more social housing. Of course, we know Canada's in a housing crisis. We need housing at various ends of the spectrum. And she cited a number from a Scotiabank study, actually, which is that Canada's social housing stock is about 3.5% of Canada's housing stock right now. Scotiabank has said we need to at least double it in order to be within the OECD average. And in response to my colleague's question, which was why does the Conservative leader never talk about building social housing, he said we don't need a Soviet-style takeover of housing. Do you agree with the Conservative leader that Scotiabank is recommending a Soviet takeover of housing in Canada?
Nice spin.
The report by Rebecca Young, I believe it is, I think it has very important fiscal implications that everyone from all parties can appreciate, which is that if we don't create more social housing, if we don't lower the cost of housing, that the cost of government transfers will necessarily have to go up, right? Because that's a big part of people's expenditures. So the report is absolutely correct. We do need to increase that stock.
But you don't feel that the report is the thin edge of the wedge for Soviet-style government in Canada?
Nope, I didn't quite read it that way.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mertens-Kirkwood, do you have any thoughts on this matter? Do you want to talk a little bit about the importance of building more social housing in Canada?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot about productivity so far today. And housing is a huge drain on productivity. We heard that in the tourism context, that if people can't live where they want to work, it's hard to get the workers you need. It's hard to attract the workers we need. Housing is a huge issue. And social housing is the answer for a lot of reasons. One is that it's actually affordable. I mean, there's one thing to just provide more market-based supply, which is going to be more high-end housing that people can't afford. It's another to provide actually affordable housing, especially publicly owned housing. It also makes a lot of sense fiscally, because if governments are building housing, they own assets, and it's not necessarily a net cost to the government. So that's really important. It's also an opportunity to build more green housing, think more about how we design our cities in again, a more thoughtful way than just allowing sprawl, which is not going to solve many of our problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Blakey. And now we've got MP Richards again. Thank you.
So back to you, Ms. Potter. I mentioned I had a couple of questions for you, and we got time for one, but that's okay. I was able to steal some more time here, so we'll get to the second one that I wanted to ask you about. One of the challenges that there can be for the industry in Canada, and at least in some parts of the country in particular, is is trying to lengthen out our season. I mean, we know that often for some parts of the country in particular, that summer season is so critical. But if we can lengthen out the season, of course, that helps. And one of the ways to kind of get a longer season to get some business during shoulder season is some of that convention business. And I think you did reference it a little bit earlier. But I wonder if you could just speak to it a little bit, because I know the challenge often can be, this business books 2, 3, 5 years out. And we've had a little bit of a bump kind of coming out of COVID. But I know that I'm hearing from many in the industry about, concerns over the next few years in terms of the amount of business that'll be booked or is booked. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the impacts on your industry of some of the uncertainty that has been that was created, with things like, our country being kind of one of the last ones to remove border restrictions coming out of COVID. And so people felt, would the border be open? Would it not be? Things like visas and how difficult they've been able to be to get. Some of the chaos that we saw at our airports last summer. I mean, these are all things that, challenges that have been created because of our current government. And I wonder if you can just speak a little bit to some of the impacts that some of that has had on the ability to attract some of that convention business over the next few years, and what kind of impacts we'll see on that, and maybe just even speak to how important that business is to the industry in attracting people.
Thank you for the question. So business events and business travel represents 40% of our industry. That would be the equivalent of the entire tourism industry in Ontario. And so if we took Ontario out of the equation, what would that look like for our industry here in Canada? Business events also book out several years in advance, in fact, up to 10 years in advance. The business events that have been on the books coming out of the last few years, or events that were rebooked because they had been booked during the pandemic. But looking forward in our calendars, so 25, 26, 27 and beyond, we are very, very thin on the bookings here in Canada. And part of that is, reputational related, in that is Canada still hard to get to? Are we still a difficult country to get into? We've been working very closely with IRCC on, visitor visas for business events and trying to get that system streamlined, but still causing a challenge. We've been working very closely with CBSA on their CARM initiative and making sure that a regulation that was meant for new product coming into the country didn't adversely affect product coming into the country on a temporary basis. But it is an important part of our business in extending the shoulder season, as you correctly said. Business events tend to take place in the fall. I'm in Vancouver today because I am attending a business event, and in the spring. And so these are the months where hotels would typically be slower than they would be in the high season of the summer. So they're an incredibly important part, but they also contribute to the wealth and well-being of the local communities in which they come into. And so they are vital for helping to keep businesses like restaurants and retail open and profitable. So not only do we need to continue to market and to promote Canada as a destination of choice for business events, but we need to make sure that the processes around how those delegates would come into the country are streamlined and working properly. Modernization at our border and access into our country is another area where we would like to see technology become more part of the process for getting folks into and out of the country. Things like biometrics and digital passport controls. These are technologies that are being used in other countries around the world and in some places within our own competitive set, and certainly would help to elevate Canada as a destination for business events in the future.
Thank you, MP Richards. And now to PS Bendayan, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to begin with our representatives from Université de Québec. I would like to begin with a question on student loans. Our government eliminated interest on student loans, federal student loans. That was last year, and we've transferred the money to the government of Quebec to have a similar type of elimination for interest on student loans in Quebec. I'd like to know if you would have liked to see the Quebec government eliminate interest on student loans for our Quebec students. Thank you for the question. I can tell you that we are very aware of this issue. I myself am on the advisory committee for financial assistance and studies of the minister, and we regularly try to raise awareness with regards to financial access to studies, the fact that loans and bursaries, student loans are a strategic issue, and that student debt load is an important issue. And with the population that we have at Université du Québec and all these measures that allow to reduce this barrier, it's a welcome. I don't want to involve myself in political relationships, but there are choices that were made, historically speaking, by Quebec in order to make studies as accessible as possible. I believe that the loan program in Quebec is quite generous, but we can always improve it and improve accessibility to studies. Thank you, Mrs. Poncelet.
Mr. Gray and the Canadian Chamber. Mr. Gray, one of your members, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, has questioned Danielle Smith's proposal to withdraw from the Canada Pension Plan, really questioning the true benefits for Albertans. And the Calgary Chamber president, I believe, has stated, and I'm quoting him now, "We've benefited from being part of a bigger pool. That means the expenses are shared, the risks are shared," end quote. The Chamber also added that the province cannot rely on the strong investment performance that the National Fund enjoys. Is that something that you're hearing as well, Mr. Gray?
I think the two threats that I'm hearing most from businesses are concerns about labor mobility in terms of, retirement, funds being applicable across provinces, and how that would affect business operations. Any business that operates in Ottawa and Gatineau can tell you that moving employees across the border, even temporarily, is sort of a tax nightmare and not necessarily worth the squeeze. But I do take note from the absence of any mention in the throne speech and the desire not to push forward to a referendum until a firm final number is apparent and clear and decided upon. That there will be very little progress on this in the near future, which I think is something we're grateful for. Again, uncertainty in the business investing environment across provinces is not something the Canadian Chamber ever advocates for.
But you're aware, of course, of the Calgary Chamber's position?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And do you share the Calgary Chamber's position?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have 1 minute.
Mr. Chair, I would like to put the following motion on notice, and I will read it into the record. That the chair of the committee immediately report to the House that the committee, 1, celebrates the Canada Pension Plan as the foundation of a secure and dignified retirement for tens of millions of Canadians and a pillar of Canada's economy. 2, recognize the important contribution of the Quebec Pension Plan, which was established independently at the same time as the Canada Pension Plan. And 3, stands with the majority of Albertans who opposed Premier Danielle Smith's dangerous plan to withdraw from the Canada Pension Plan that threatens the pensions of millions of seniors and hardworking Canadians from coast to coast to coast. I understand, of course, that putting this on notice today means that we will be able to vote on it at a future meeting. Thank you, Mr.
48
Chair.
hours, yes. Okay, so that is your time, PS Bendayan, and now we are on to our third round, members, and this will be our final round. It'll be MP Morantz, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would like to turn the mic over to Mr. Hallen for a moment, who has a couple of motions he'd like to introduce.
Thanks, Marty. Chair, I just wanted to move two motions quickly. I don't want to take up too much time. The first being that the committee concur in and report to the House.
Sorry to interrupt, option. Are you moving or are you giving notice?
Giving notice.
Giving
today.
notice,
Yeah,
yes.
move
Okay,
these,
you
no.
did. We did hear move, so giving notice.
Sorry, my
okay,
bad.
can you
Yeah,
just
I don't wanna...
can you start from the top and that you are giving notice?
Chair, I'd like to give notice of my motion today. I have two of them. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll get started. The first being that the committee concur in and report to the House the comments made by the Governor of the Bank of Canada at his appearance at the Finance Committee on October 30th, 2023, when he admitted that Trudeau's carbon tax is inflationary, and if it were repealed, that it would slow inflation by, quote, 0.6%. That's the first one. The second one I'd like to put on notice is that given recent media reports that the Public Health Agency of Canada lost $150 million on an unfulfilled contract last year and won't say why, and given the Finance Committee is empowered to consider and review budgetary policy, including government spending, the committee undertake a study of the Canada Public Health Agency's unfulfilled contracts, including the lost $150 million in taxpayers' money for an unfulfilled contract with an undisclosed vendor, that the witness list include, but not be limited to, the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and the President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Health, that the study take no more than 4 meetings, that the committee report its findings to the House, that the committee send for all documents and emails related to the $150 million unfulfilled contract, and that the unredacted documents and emails be received by the committee no later than 1 month following the passage of this motion, that any redactions of the documents or emails due to privacy only be made by the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel of the House of Commons, and that these documents be posted on the committee's webpage. Thank you. I'll now turn it back over to my colleague.
Thank you.
Point of order.
Juste, Monsieur le Président.
I'd like to thank my colleagues. The interpreters have indicated that the motions that they received were not the motions that that were being read, and so it was hard to interpret them. Given that it's a notice of motion, I hope that I'll have the time to receive this in written form. So I just wanted to indicate what the interpreters were saying over the microphone. Thank you.
Marie, and thank you for that. And yeah, please, members, when you do present anything that may be detailed, and we want to capture that language, make sure that you're clear, concise with that. With your information, so that the interpreters can capture that. But if you can submit those to the members and to the clerk, that would be appreciative. Okay, so MP Morantz.
Just for time's sake, how much time do I actually have?
You have 2 minutes and 20 seconds.
Okay, and in that time, I want to give Ms. Oliver a chance to talk about real-time rail. And one of the things I'm interested in, Ms. Oliver, is in your brief, you say, we share the concerns of former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge that Canada's apparent complacency in bringing key elements of its financial system into the digital age is a result of a lack of political will. I wonder if you could comment on your concerns in that regard vis-a-vis the federal government.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, we did include that in our submission, and I noted my counterpart at Questrade, who presented last month, also shared that quote. So it was very much, I think, represents a shared sentiment across our sector. A global review of real-time payments that was undertaken by ACI that looked across the globe found that government mandates are almost a basic requirement for banks and payment firms to move to real-time payments, and governments are realizing that they can help boost their economies through real-time. So that's a direct quote, and I think it's supported by the U.S. Federal Reserve moving forward with FedNow, despite the presence of privately owned payment rails and their projection that FedNow, their version of RTR, will help reduce $10 billion of late and insufficient fees that individuals and businesses face. So we certainly believe.
Want to highlight one other thing in your brief. You say that the end result is that Canadians and small business continue to face high fees, some of the highest in the world, every time they make a single payment. At a time when budgets are stretched for both consumers and small businesses, these costs are difficult to bear and inequitable. It's a very strong statement. And I get back to my initial question. I know there's only a few seconds, but in terms of cost efficiency for consumers, what would this policy mean if it were implemented?
Yeah, well, it would mean that when money is moved, it would land in real time, and it would be data-rich payments that would provide end-to-end traceability, can help reduce fraud, better enable investigations. When you look at the delivery of emergency relief benefits, for example, by government, or even just transactions between businesses through supply chains, it would mean that businesses and individuals could put their money to work immediately upon receiving it. But the reality is that RTR and its efficiencies and level playing field pricing, regardless of the size of the host institution, of the financial institution, will come at a cost to large incumbent financial institutions. Delayed settlement means that the institution that's moving the money, it accrues interest or is able to otherwise utilize funds when the settlement is delayed. If I send you something at 6 p.m. on a Friday and it's a holiday Monday, that money is not going to land until Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. When you compound each of those transactions, it's a significant amount and a significant barrier to cooperation.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Oliver, MP Morantz, and now to MP Thompson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm sorry I'm not in person today, but I am quite grateful for the opportunity to join you hybrid. Thank you to all the witnesses. I really appreciate what you've been able to bring to this session pre-budget. If I could begin with you, Ms. Nugent, and I'm sorry the technical difficulties that we can't hear your responses to the questions today, but do appreciate that you're going to follow through. I do want to note that Oceans North is involved in very important research in Atlantic Canada, and of course I'm coming to you from St. John's East. It is alarming for me to note that this past summer, August in particular, we saw the highest temperatures recorded in the Grand Banks, which you may know, the others in the room may or may not know, a significant fishery ground, an important part of the marine ecosystem. Clearly, Ocean North, Ms. Nugent, has done tremendous work on strengthening the link between ocean and climate. Would you respond for the committee on the importance of climate change data for in fisheries management? So that I would appreciate, and I look forward to that response. If I could switch now to Mr. Merton's Kirkwood on childcare, and I'm also pleased to note that Newfoundland and Labrador, even though population-wise we're quite small, we have been able to reach the target of $10 a day childcare 3 years ahead of schedule. And I think that's quite important to note. But even having that, I think, significant accomplishment, obviously there's still challenges in this province and I believe across the country. In childcare, both through lack of infrastructure and also workforce, and I believe compensation is an important part of the recruitment, the retention within the sector. Could you speak to the provinces, territories that are moving forward on compensation, specifically wages for early childhood educators. And apart from the wages, what are some of the other challenges that provinces, territories are encountering in being able to ensure that the needs within the provinces, territories meet the demand for childhood spaces? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's definitely something that's near and dear to my heart. I have 3 young kids, so I'm well acquainted with childcare in Canada. That being said, this is not my particular area of expertise, so I'd be happy to have our childcare expert follow up with you, but I'm not comfortable commenting on that.
Thank you, and I would really appreciate the follow-up. If I could ask you about housing, and actually before I move into the question, are you comfortable with a housing question, or do you want me to ask and then have follow-up?
Yeah, I can talk. I can talk about housing.
Sorry, and I wasn't being facetious there. I just didn't want to waste the time that I have. Housing supply obviously is key to tackling inflation, affordability in the country, and we hear this repeatedly in the committee. And we've certainly heard this over the last few weeks with some key recommendations. One is reviving incentives for purpose-built rentals, providing support for vulnerable households, increasing social housing, revise local zoning and permitting systems, as well as reevaluating regulations. Of these recommendations, could you provide some insight on the structural issues that we're currently encountering in this housing crisis?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, there are a lot of issues, right? We know the housing crisis we're dealing with today has been building for decades. It's no one government at any level's responsibility. It's kind of everyone's responsibility that we let it get this bad. We did hear earlier about how we've stopped investing in social housing, and that's one dimension of this problem. But we've decided to try and let the market solve this problem, and it hasn't. We need government to take a stronger role, and that is of course true at all levels. You mentioned zoning; that's a huge barrier at the municipal level, and that's a tricky thing for the federal government to engage in. But the federal government has recently started getting back into the game of building housing, or at least supporting housing, and that's absolutely the right direction. And we'd like to see more of that, and certainly more money moving towards that. As I mentioned earlier, it's worth noting that when governments build housing, they're building assets, and as long as we retain ownership of those assets, that's not a net cost to the government. So that's worth noting on the balance sheet of the government.
Thank you very much, and
thank you. Thank you.
That is the time. Thank you, MP Thompson. And now to MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mrs. Ponce-Leroux. You give importance to the ability of departments to support research in order to respond to their needs. So when we think about research, we think about granting bodies. So what role should be played by the departments, and how to ensure independence of universities that might have as a partner some departments? How to make sure that there is independence in the work that is being done? Thank you. The departments do fund applied research according to their priorities. I would refer you to the Bouchard report, and it explains very well the difference between something that is freely decided by research, freely decided upon by researchers, and targeted research, and both are important for the scientific ecosystem. University has a specific expertise that can assist departments. Before going to the second part of your question, I'd like to provide some examples. For example, research funded by a department on restoration and protection of fish habitat affected by mining activities in northern settings, or research on the tourism industry issues to ensure adequate support to small and medium-sized businesses. So how to make sure that the research is independent and that we can trust the researchers regardless where the request is coming from, there's ethics, research ethics for independence is used, and this allows to analyze the fact, to reach conclusions, to publish them. And these are the mechanisms that exist right now in universities to guarantee what we call academic freedom. This exists to make sure that regardless of the origin of the request, it's independent, the work is done according to academic freedom, and the researcher will provide conclusions. Thank you. Another subject? Could you speak to the idea of... I'm sorry, could you repeat that? So this is a proposal that we made in our brief with regards to the legitimacy of scientific careers in French. We, throughout Canada, give a great importance to recognize our researchers so that they can obtain awards and distinctions so that research in French can grow in Canada. So in many organizations, in smaller, medium-sized, and even larger institutions, Francophone institutions, we need teams, targeted teams to work with researchers to work on files and present them, for example, to the Royal Society of Canada. We have members of the society that say with some large English universities, they would table 48 files in 1 year, and others 0, 1, or 2. And so these types of secretariats can help researchers to build their files in order to bring their work, and so that this can be published and broadcast. So for those that don't have a secretariat, that it be created so that their files and their Francophone research be published throughout Canada. We could work with Heritage Canada or other stakeholders for this. Thank you.
MP Blakey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And to Mr. Mertens Kirkwood, I'm wondering, there's a lot of talk on Parliament Hill, obviously, about the carbon tax. Not enough talk about the profits of oil and gas companies and the sizable increase in profit that they've seen over the last couple of years. I'm wondering, you know, New Democrats have proposed a windfall tax. It's something that's being done in other jurisdictions across the ideological spectrum. There's Conservative government, for instance, in the UK that brought in a windfall profit tax. I wonder if you can speak to the impact of large oil and gas profits on Canadian household budgets and how a windfall tax might be used to remedy some of that situation.
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, the windfall tax is something we do support. We've included it in the alternative federal budget. We think it's necessary. As you point out, oil and gas companies are raking in record profits, or at least over the last 3 years, record profits. Production is at all-time high, even as employment is down from 2014. So more and more of that money, and we heard earlier actually on this issue of productivity, we have the corporate sector, and the oil and gas sector is perhaps the best example of this, sitting on more and more cash, not investing it in productive assets, not investing it in people, not investing in training, paying it out as dividends. And it's a huge issue, not only from an equity perspective, not only from a climate perspective, but certainly an economic perspective. We're at a point where oil and gas profits are contributing to inflation, at least as much as the carbon tax is, as much as people like to harp on that. And we could use that money for more productive things.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, would you say it's fair to say that, you know, the oil and gas sector sees itself as a leader in the Canadian economy, but isn't living up to the requirements of leadership when we talk about business investment in Canada?
Yeah, the oil and gas sector is one important part of the Canadian economy, but it's only one part of the Canadian economy. It's often, I think, overblown how big the oil and gas sector is in Canada, even though it plays an outsized political role, certainly. But that sector is certainly not helping us when it comes to our climate obligations. And again, as I point out, at a kind of a dollar invested basis, contributes far fewer jobs and community benefits than many other sectors of the economy, despite those enormous profits.
So one of those other important sectors, obviously, is the care economy. Could you speak a little bit to the importance of the care economy in Canada and the value of investing in that sector?
Yes, thank you. Well, a care economy is super important for two reasons. One is that care work is low carbon work, and that's important. We know we need to move to a cleaner economy, and people working in healthcare, people working in teaching, and all kinds of services, often public services, that's low carbon work, and that's great. That's how we get economic growth without using more resources. The other reason it's important is you can create a lot more jobs in care work than you can for the same amount of money spent in oil and gas, which is extremely capital intensive. It's not very job intensive. So we don't need to, despite the size of the oil and gas industry, we don't need to make up 100% of that industry in other sectors to retain the total amount of employment. We can create far more jobs in the care economy and other sectors for the same amount of investment.
Thank you.
MP Blakey, and now to MP Lawrence, please.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be at committee, and great witnesses today. Honestly, wish I could ask all of you some questions, but my questions will focus with respect to Ms. Oliver and open banking there. So I just want to, first of all, this is a question I asked another fintech, a representative from another fintech company. And do you know what time of year it is?
It's fall.
Okay. And do you know when the government said that they would have open banking legislation?
I believe they made a commitment in their platform for open banking in 2023.
2023, yeah, I believe it was January, and we're now 9 months past that, and I would and maybe you could also share with the committee where Canada is falling with respect to regulation and framework, just anecdotally is fine, and why open banking is an important part of modernization that must happen to Canadians' financial framework, or we will fall even further and further behind. Of course, knowing we are near last in productivity in the OECD right now.
Yeah, thank you for the interest in open banking. Yes, certainly several countries have introduced open banking, and many, for example, the UK are now in their second and others in third iterations. Both RTR and open banking, there is not a single country in the world that has introduced them and then removed them, so we take comfort in that. Last spring, the UK reported $12 billion saved by individuals, pounds, and £6 billion saved by businesses thanks to open banking. And last week, the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which focuses on protection, proposed a rule to introduce open banking in the U.S. It is, Canada has unique circumstances, which were communicated by the advisory group. We have been very pleased to participate in the implementation working group. So the actual work into the merits of open banking and important considerations, that work has been done and was conclusive. The last step is the implementation plan, and we have seen a lot of interest from all parties in moving that forward. And, if you look just at the FHSA, we had over 14,000 clients on a wait list before we even had a product in market. We've opened an average of 1,000 FHSAs a day since we put the product in market, and we're approaching 100,000 accounts. And the reason I mention that is that open banking and RTR will make it easier for consumers to shop around to figure out if there is a smaller institution that has been able to drill into their unique circumstances, newcomers, renters, gig economy workers, and help de-risk them, because they may not currently fit into a box that gets them a competitive rate for a mortgage, for a line of credit, for a student loan. There are products all over the world that use open banking to de-risk those clients so that they are offered a more competitive rate.
Thank you very much, and that was some fantastic testimony. Maybe if I could just summarize that and then ask you a question to build on that. So I'm aware of the UK example, and so what you said, there's 18 billion between businesses and consumers in pounds, 18 billion pounds. I cannot remember what the conversion rate is right off the top of my head, but I imagine it's around 40 billion Canadian dollars in savings for business and consumers. So we're introducing competition in the financial services market in a very competition deprived area and sector of our economy. For one, we are driving down costs for consumers and for businesses. And then the last part, which I thought was very interesting as well, is you're going to allow individuals who may not otherwise qualify for credit to get credit because there's additional data that can be provided with respect to open banking, allowing individuals who couldn't maybe get a mortgage before or even get a place to stay because they couldn't qualify for rent, being able to get that. So we're going to help the most vulnerable. We're going to help businesses. We're going to help consumers, and we're going to restore a little bit more. We're going to input a little bit more competition into the market. Have I said anything incorrectly, or would you say that was fair?
Yes. So the data from the UK is based on their 2019 data was, yes, 18 billion across individuals and businesses. And exactly as you say, one of the best Canadian fintechs, Borrowell, allows renters to build their or build credit by demonstrating proof of on-time monthly rental payments. Because at the moment, your on-time payment of your phone bill has a bigger impact on your credit score than paying your rent. And so that is the kind of product that could be improved and delivered more broadly through open banking. And they've been, a very long advocate on that, and we've been proud to work with them.
Thank you. And thank you, MP Lawrence. And so this will be our final questioner for our session today. And it's MP Weiler for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to continue with questioning with Mr. Mertens Kirkwood. And I think some questions that will be squarely in your wheelhouse here as well. Both yesterday and today, there's an event happening in Ottawa, the Sustainable Finance Forum, where, amongst other people, the Sustainable Finance Action Council is here, where and this group was set up in 2021 to provide advice to the Minister of Finance on how to build a sustainable finance system. And part of that is the development of a taxonomy that could be utilized across the sector. And we know from other countries that have brought this in, both for transition finance and green finance, that it's had a big impact. We heard yesterday, actually, that Japan has had about $28 billion of investment in the transition space in the wake of bringing that in. So I was hoping you could explain to this committee the importance of Canada adopting such a framework itself, both to crowd in investment as well as to deal with issues like greenwashing in Canada.
Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, the issue with greenwashing is it's kind of easy to say that any investment can be green in some way, and that's a real risk, and we've seen it in a lot of climate policy in Canada historically, where you get like a tiny little bit of reduction in emissions, but that's not actually, there's no structural change. And having a robust taxonomy that can make it clear to investors, can make it clear to governments what kinds of firms, what kinds of sectors are making a meaningful contribution to long-term emissions reductions is very important. Otherwise, we crowd investment into short-term solutions that can reduce emissions maybe the next 5 years, but actually make it more costly to reduce emissions in the long term. And unfortunately, we see that a lot with, for example, coal to gas conversions, or a lot of investment in blue hydrogen, a lot of investment in carbon capture. These are the sorts of investments that might reduce emissions at a very high cost over the next 5 to 10 years, but actually make it more expensive to get to net zero in the long term. So having a credible taxonomy can make sure that our investments are aligned with our long-term goals.
Thanks for that. And you mentioned in your opening, as part of the alternative federal budget, a recommendation for further investments in cleaning the grid. Of course, in the budget last year, or this year rather, we've provided for tax credits to invest in that, so that we can build on the fact that we have 85% of our grid is non-emitting, but obviously we need to double or maybe even triple that to reach our net zero goals. So I was hoping you could maybe explain to the committee why we need this additional investment on top of the tax credits that are already there, and especially considering this is an area that is within the provincial jurisdiction.
Yeah, thank you. That's another great question. So first of all, the tax credit, the electricity credit in particular is very good because it's mostly going to be useful to provincial utilities who need to build out that capacity, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that was eligible for Crown corporations to use that. The reason the federal government needs to get involved is one of the biggest limitations and also opportunities in electricity is interprovincial ties and regional ties. And as soon as you're crossing borders, immediately this is a federal concern. And the more we can build out this grid between provinces, including between provinces in the U.S. where applicable, between different communities, the more that we can build out the kind of connective tissue of the electricity system, the more that other institutions can plug into it. Because, there are lots of private investors who want to build wind farms. They want to build solar farms. It looks good. It's exciting, but they need to plug into something. And if we can't provide that grid to plug into, it's going to really hamstring our ability to decarbonize.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Mr. Gray, and really along the same vein here. I was hoping you might be able to explain from the position of the chamber and your members the potential for growth and wealth creation that you see in the transition to a net zero economy.
Sure. Sort of very much along those lines, the taxonomy is clearly important. The other is disclosure, frankly. Investors deserve to know where exactly their money is going and what exactly it's going to yield and at what level of risk. We don't have that yet, and I think concurrent with that is helping small businesses sort of understand their own exposures, right? Not every family restaurant is going to have a data scientist on staff, right? So I think there's a lot of work that could be done in this. We, as the Canadian Chamber, have called upon the government to make good on its promises to it was called the Climate Data Analytics Center, to sort of invest that so that investors can have a fulsome understanding of their exposure to climate-related risk.
Thank you, MP Weiler, and we want to thank the witnesses on behalf of all the members of this committee and all the staff, everybody that helps make this possible for your testimony. For our pre-budget consultation in advance of our 2024 budget. I do want to apologize again to Miss Amy Nugent for listening to all the testimony that you heard from others, and I'm sure if members have more questions for Miss Nugent, please send them to her, and I'm sure she will get us some answers back. But we thank you for that, and we will receive your brief and your opening statement, and that will be part of our report. So thank you very much. And on that, members, we're adjourned.